Sometimes fate lurks in the simplest business of life. Thomas Mitchell stopped his horse in front of the abandoned building he had just bought. 25 cents. It was everything the sheriff's widow had asked for the old barn that was 3 miles from the town of Cedar Valley. The midday heat made the air tremble over the parched wood, and the silence of the desert seemed to whisper ancient secrets. The structure was not impressive. Wood faded by the inclement sun, a few loose planks swaying in the warm wind that blew from the distant mountains. The tin roof was covered in red dust, and the hinges of the main door creaked even without anyone touching them. Thomas got off his horse and tied the reins to a stake driven into the barren ground. He had arrived in Cedar Valley only a week earlier, carrying little more than hopes and a few coins in his pocket. Word that he was looking for work spread quickly through the small town, and that's how he learned the story of Sheriff Samuel Morrison. The man had disappeared 6 months ago, leaving behind a grieving wife and property that no one else wanted to buy. Mrs. Morrison was a small, nervous woman, with eyes that seemed to carry the weight of many sleepless nights. When Thomas looked up the barn, she could hardly speak properly. She said only that she needed to get rid of everything that reminded her of her husband, and that 25 cents would be enough for her to leave that city and start again somewhere else. Thomas pushed open the main door, and it gave way with a low groan. The interior was immersed in a golden penumbra cut by beams of light that entered through the cracks between the boards. The floor was made of beaten earth, covered by a thin layer of old straw. A few rusty tools hang on the walls, mouldy ropes in a corner, and the smell of old wood mixed with something harder to identify. But Thomas was not a man to give up easily. He had learned that opportunities often lurk in the most unlikely places. He began to walk through the interior of the barn, observing every detail. The ceiling beams were solid despite their weathered appearance. The space was larger than it appeared from the outside, with a second floor accessible by a wooden staircase that creaked with every step. Upstairs, he found some long damaged bags of grain and a small table leaning against one of the walls. On the table, a leather-bound notebook with the pages yellowed by time. Thomas opened it and saw that it was full of notes in Sheriff Morrison's handwriting, numbers, dates, names of people in the city. It looked like a record of some kind, but the information was encrypted in a way he couldn't understand right away. The sun was beginning to decline when Thomas decided he had seen enough for a day. Keeping the notebook in his pocket seemed like the right thing to do. Perhaps those notes explained why the sheriff had disappeared so suddenly, leaving behind a lifetime built in Cedar Valley. Perhaps they also explained why no one else had been interested in buying that property at such a low price. When he left the barn, the sky already had the orange color of dusk. Thomas mounted his horse and looked one last time at the building that now belonged to him. There was something about this place that he couldn't define, a sense that he was about to discover much more than he had bargained for when he handed the coins to the widow Morrison. The desert wind blew harder, kicking up small swirls of dust around the barn. In the silence that followed, Thomas had the impression of hearing a sound coming from somewhere below the dirt floor, an almost imperceptible sound, as if something was moving in the depths of the earth. But when he paid attention, the sound had ceased. Perhaps it was just the wind, or some small animal seeking shelter for the approaching night. Thomas whipped the horse and headed back to the city, taking with him the first pieces of a puzzle he did not yet know how to assemble. Thomas spent the whole night studying Sheriff Morrison's notebook by the light of a lamp in the room he had rented in the Cedar Valley boarding house. The notes looked like a complex code, with numbers repeating in strange sequences and names of people he recognized as residents of the city. There were dates that went back 3 years, always accompanied by dollar values that varied between 50 and 300. Morning arrived with the merciless desert sun, but Thomas had already deciphered part of the mystery. Sheriff Morrison wasn't just recording ordinary police occurrences. I was documenting something much more complex. The numbers corresponded to coordinates, and the dollar values seemed to indicate quantities of something precious that was being moved in secret. Thomas returned to the barn even before breakfast. This time he brought a shovel borrowed from the boarding house and a flashlight to better explore the interior of the building. The morning sun poured in through the cracks in the wood, creating patterns of light and shadow that danced as the clouds passed across the sky. He began to examine the dirt floor more carefully. At some points the earth looked softer, as if it had been stirred recently. Following the coordinates noted in the notebook, Thomas identified a specific area near the back wall where the soil was slightly different in color. The first shovel revealed that the earth there was even softer. The second brought to light a piece of waxed fabric, the kind used to protect valuable objects from moisture. Thomas's heart raced when he realized he was about to find out what the sheriff had so carefully hidden. He dug for almost an hour until the shovel hit something solid. It was a wooden box, not very large, but heavy enough to require considerable effort to get out of the hole. The lid was locked with a simple padlock that Thomas was able to break with a few hammers using the handle of the shovel. What he found inside made him need to lean on the wall so he wouldn't fall. Gold coins shone even in the dim light of the barn's interior. There were not many, perhaps 50, but each of them was worth more than Thomas earned in a month's work. Along with the coins, there were 3 small gold bars, each about the size of the palm of your hand. But what caught his attention the most was a sealed envelope that was at the bottom of the box. Thomas opened it carefully and found a letter written by Sheriff Morrison's own hand. The handwriting was the same as in the notebook, but the message was much more direct and disturbing. The letter revealed that Morrison had uncovered a smuggling scheme that involved several important people from Cedar Valley. Respectable merchants were diverting gold from the region's mines, selling it to buyers in Mexico, and dividing the profits among themselves. The sheriff had managed to intercept some of the gold as evidence, but he knew his life was in danger as soon as the smugglers found out what he knew. Thomas read the letter 3 times before he was able to fully process the information. Morrison had disappeared because he found he couldn't trust anyone in town. Even the local judge was involved in the scheme. The sheriff had planned to use the gold as evidence for federal authorities, but never got a chance to execute his plan. The last part of the letter was a desperate plea. Morrison wrote that if something happened to him, whoever found the treasure should take it to the proper authorities in Sacramento. It was the only way to ensure that justice was done and that the real criminals paid for their crimes. Thomas put the letter in his pocket and looked again at the gold in the box. Now he understood why the widow Morrison had sold the barn for practically nothing. She probably knew or suspected what her husband had discovered, and she wanted to get away from Cedar Valley as soon as possible. The sound of horses' hooves approaching made Thomas quickly close the box and push it back into the hole. He covered everything with dirt and spread straw on top, trying to make the floor look as natural as possible. When the knight stopped outside the barn, he was already casually leaning against one of the walls, pretending to examine the rusty tools. 3 men entered the barn. Thomas recognized them as Henry Walsh, owner of the general store, Marcus Cole, owner of the local bank, and Jake Sullivan, who controlled most of the transportation business in the area. Everyone had serious expressions and looked around as if they were looking for something specific. Walsh was the first to speak, asking what Thomas was doing there. The answer was simple and honest. He had bought the barn from the widow Morrison and was evaluating the condition of the building. The 3 men exchanged glances that Thomas pretended not to notice, but which confirmed his suspicions about their involvement in the scheme, uncovered by the sheriff. After a few minutes of seemingly casual conversation, the 3 of them left, but Thomas knew they would come back, and when they returned, it would be better if he were no longer in Cedar Valley. Thomas waited until nightfall to return to the barn. The new moon plunged the desert into almost complete darkness, broken only by the faint light of the stars. He had spent the rest of the day in the city, discreetly watching the movements of Walsh, Cole, and Sullivan. The three men met twice at the bank, always with worried expressions. Back in the barn, Thomas lit the lantern and dug up the box with the gold again. This time, he examined each item more carefully. In addition to the coins and bars he had found in the morning, he discovered a small secret compartment at the bottom of the box. Inside were more documents that Morrison had kept as evidence. The papers revealed impressive details about the criminal operation. For nearly 2 years, smugglers had been diverting gold from local mines using falsified documents. They declared smaller quantities to the authorities and sold the excess to Mexican buyers who paid prices far above the official market. The profit was divided among the participants in the scheme, which included not only the 3 men Thomas had seen, but also the town's former judge and at least 2 other merchants. Morrison had been meticulous in his investigations. He had copied documents, written down dates of secret meetings, and even drawn maps showing the routes used to transport the smuggled gold. Everything was there, organized in such a way that any federal authority could easily understand the extent of the crime. But what impressed Thomas most was a letter Morrison had written to his wife but never delivered. In it, the sheriff explained that he had discovered the scheme by chance during a routine investigation into a cattle theft. As he followed the clues, he realized that he was facing something much bigger and more dangerous. Morrison also wrote about his fears. He knew that he was being watched by the criminals and that his life was in danger. He had tried to contact the authorities in Sacramento, but his letters did not seem to be reaching their destination. He suspected that someone was intercepting his mail, probably the same postal worker who was part of the scheme. The decision to hide the gold and evidence in the barn had been desperate. Morrison hoped that if something happened to him, someone honest would eventually find out the truth and move the case forward. He couldn't imagine that it would be an outsider like Thomas who would find his hidden treasure. Thomas was so engrossed in reading the documents that he hardly heard the sound of footsteps approaching the barn. By the time he realized, it was too late to hide everything again. The door opened and Walsh entered, followed by Cole and Sullivan. This time, they were not alone. A 4th man accompanied them, someone Thomas didn't recognize but who carried a gun on his waistband. The situation became tense immediately. Walsh looked at the open box, at the documents scattered on the floor, and at Thomas's expression. You didn't have to be very smart to understand what was happening. The stranger had discovered exactly what they hoped would remain buried forever. Cole got straight to the point. He wanted to know what Thomas intended to do with that information. The honest answer would be that he planned to take everything to federal authorities, as requested by Morrison. But Thomas realized that this would not be the answer the 4 men wanted to hear. Sullivan suggested that perhaps there was a way to resolve the situation that would benefit everyone involved. After all, Thomas now knew about gold and could become a partner in the business rather than a problem to be solved. The proposal was financially tempting, but Thomas knew that accepting would be complicit in the crimes Morrison had so carefully documented. The unknown man remained silent, but his presence was threatening. Thomas realized that this conversation could take a very dangerous turn if he was not careful with his words. He needed to gain time to think of a way out that would not put his life at risk. While the 4 men discussed among themselves how best to handle the situation, Thomas discreetly observed the possible exits. The main door was blocked by the criminals, but there was a small window at the back of the barn that might have been large enough for him to pass through. What Thomas didn't know was that his decision over the next few hours would not only determine his own fate, but also whether the justice Morrison had sought would finally be served. The missing sheriff had left a heavy responsibility in the hands of an outsider who now found himself at the center of a much more complicated situation than he had imagined when he bought that barn for 25 cents. Thomas pretended to consider the proposal of the 4 men while mentally calculating his chances of escape. Walsh went on to talk about the benefits of becoming a partner in the scheme, promising a generous share of future profits. Cole nodded, trying to look convincing, while Sullivan kept his eyes fixed on the documents scattered on the floor. The unknown man, whom the others called only Frank, stood leaning against the doorway, watching Thomas's every move. His right hand rested casually on the handle of the gun in a clear demonstration that friendly conversation could change tone quickly if necessary. Thomas knew he needed to act soon. With each passing minute, his situation became more complicated. He decided to use the only advantage he had, the detailed knowledge about the barn he had acquired during his explorations. He knew every loose plank, every creaking beam, every shadow cast by the structure. As Walsh explained how the gold was transported to Mexico, Thomas took a few steps toward the stairs that led to the second floor. He pretended to be interested in taking a closer look at some of Morrison's documents, but he was actually positioning himself strategically. If he managed to get up there, he would have access to the small window he had noticed at the back of the barn. Cole noticed the movement and asked what Thomas was doing. The answer was quick. "I wanted to check if there was more evidence hidden in the upper floor." The explanation seemed to satisfy the criminals, who allowed him to go upstairs as long as Frank accompanied him. On the second floor, Thomas pretended to look for more documents as he looked out the back window. It was smaller than he had imagined, but still big enough for a thin person to pass through. The problem was that Frank was only a few steps away, watching every move carefully. That's when Thomas had a risky idea. He approached the table where he had found Morrison's notebook and pretended to discover something important. He called Frank to see it closely, saying that he had found a map with the location of more hidden gold. The man approached, curious, letting his guard down for a crucial moment. Thomas took advantage of the distraction to push the table against Frank, causing him to lose his balance. Before the criminal could recover, Thomas was already running towards the window. He quickly opened it and threw himself out, falling to the soft floor outside the barn. The fall was harder than he expected, but Thomas quickly got up and ran in the direction where he had left his horse tied. Behind him, he heard Frank's screams warning the others about the escape. Within seconds, the four men would be outside, looking for him in the dark. Thomas mounted his horse and galloped in the opposite direction to the city. His only chance was to get to Sacramento before the criminals could organize an effective chase. He carried with him only a few of the most important documents he had managed to keep in his pocket during the confusion, but he knew they would be enough to convince federal authorities. The night ride through the desert was one of the most intense experiences of Thomas's life. The horse knew the terrain well, but the darkness made every step risky. Loose rocks, hidden holes, and thorny bushes were constant obstacles. Behind him, he occasionally heard the distant sound of other horses, indicating that the chase had begun. Thomas knew that his persecutors had advantages over him. They knew the region better, and probably had more rested horses. His only hope was that the darkness of the new night would work in his favor, making it difficult to follow in his footsteps. After 3 hours of riding, Thomas stopped by a stream so that the horse could drink water and rest. He took the opportunity to examine the documents he had brought with him. They were sufficient to prove the existence of the smuggling scheme, but they did not have all the details that Morrison had collected over months of investigation. It was then that Thomas realized that he had made a serious mistake. In the rush to escape, he had left behind not only the gold, but also most of the evidence Morrison had gathered. Without them, his word against that of 4 respectable Cedar Valley citizens might not be enough to convince the authorities. The sound of horses approaching made Thomas quickly return to the saddle. The chase had come closer than he had imagined. Now he had no choice but to keep galloping towards Sacramento, hoping he could hold the lead long enough to find help. But Thomas knew that his escape was only the beginning. Even if he managed to reach the federal authorities, he would still have to find a way to prove his accusations. And to do so, he would need to return to Cedar Valley and reclaim what he had left behind in the barn, risking not only his freedom, but also his life. Thomas arrived in Sacramento 3 days later, exhausted and with his horse almost out of strength. The journey had been more difficult than he had imagined, but he managed to throw off the pursuers by changing directions several times during the first night. The federal office was housed in a brick building downtown, and Thomas spent nearly an hour waiting to be met by someone with enough authority to hear his story. Federal Agent Samuel Hayes listened intently as Thomas recounted everything he had discovered in Cedar Valley. The documents he had brought with him were carefully examined, and Hayes confirmed that they were sufficient to open an official investigation. However, to secure convictions, it would be necessary to recover the rest of the evidence that Morrison had hidden. Hayes organized an operation to return to Cedar Valley with Thomas and 4 other federal agents. The return trip took 2 days, and when they arrived in the small town, they found that Walsh, Cole, and Sullivan had disappeared during the previous night. Apparently, someone had warned them about the imminent arrival of federal authorities. The barn was still there, just as Thomas had left it. The box with the gold remained buried in the same place, along with all the documents Morrison had so carefully guarded. Federal agents were overwhelmed by the amount of evidence the missing sheriff had been able to gather. But the biggest surprise came when Hayes decided to investigate the abandoned well that lay behind the barn. Thomas had noticed the well during his early explorations, but he hadn't given it much importance. The agents lowered ropes and discovered that Morrison had not voluntarily disappeared. The sheriff had been killed by the criminals when they discovered his investigations, and his body had been hidden at the bottom of the well. The discovery completely changed the nature of the case. It was no longer just about smuggling, but also about murder. Hayes sent telegrams to all federal offices in the region, warning of escapees and offering rewards for their captures. Thomas remained in Cedar Valley for another week, helping agents locate other evidence and identify possible accomplices. They found that the scheme was even bigger than Morrison had imagined, involving people in several cities in the region. The smuggled gold had financed other criminal activities, including document forgery and corruption of public officials. Widow Morrison received the news of her husband's death with a mixture of sadness and relief. At least now she knew what had happened to him, and she could finally grieve properly. The recovered gold was used to pay generous compensation to the family, ensuring that they could start their lives again with dignity. Walsh was captured 2 weeks later, trying to cross the border into Mexico. Cole and Sullivan were found in a town 300 miles away, but Frank was never located. The 3 captured criminals were tried and sentenced to long prison terms, finally bringing the justice Morrison had sought. Thomas decided to stay in Cedar Valley for a few more months. With the reward he received for helping solve the case, he was able to buy some land near the barn and start a new life as a cattle rancher. The barn was renovated and turned into a working stable, but Thomas never forgot the story he had discovered buried in its dirt floor. Sometimes, when the desert wind blew stronger at dusk, Thomas would think of Sheriff Morrison and how an honest man had paid with his life for trying to do the right thing. The city of Cedar Valley gradually recovered from the scandal, and people began to trust the law and justice again. The well behind the barn was sealed for good, but Thomas had a small wooden headstone built in Morrison's memory. It was a silent reminder that sometimes justice takes time to arrive, but when it does, it honors the memory of those who died defending it. Years later, when Thomas was already a respected man in the community, he used to tell the story of the barn to visitors who arrived in the area. He always ended by saying that 25 cents had been the best investment of his life, not for the gold he had found, but for the opportunity to make the truth finally come to light. The desert holds many secrets, but it also has its own ways of revealing the truth when it needs to be known. And Cedar Valley learned that heroes don't always wear badges or guns on their waists. Sometimes they're just outsiders willing to do the right thing, even when it means risking everything they own. If you like this Wild West story, please leave your like and subscribe to the channel for more exciting American Wild West narratives. Share in the comments what was the most tense moment in history for you.